welcome to another Coffee and Hardtack with the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin. This is our bi-weekly program where we are on our Facebook with various Civil War historians and educators from around the country and beyond sometimes. We are very excited for today's guest, but first, my name is Jenn Edginton. I'm Curator of Social Studies Education here at the Kenosha Museum campus. And with me, as always, is Doug Dammann, our Director of Education and the Curator of the Civil War Museum. And we're really excited for our guest today. With us is Jeff Kannel. So thank you so much for joining us, Jeff. And can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. I was I lived in Kenosha and taught for many years at the technical school there. And toward the end of that time, I started hanging out at the Civil War Museum and started working as a volunteer and then became a tour guide. And so I was always interested in history and Civil War in particular, as was my father, who was a history teacher and Civil War buff himself. So that kind of came natural. And since the museum was only a couple blocks away from where I was living, it was natural that I ended up there. So
yeah, Jeff, I remember very early on you being a fixture in our resource center and our research library on the second floor of the museum.
Yeah.
And your soon to be released book, it's entitled Make Way for Liberty, and it focuses on the lives and experiences of African American Civil War soldiers from Wisconsin. Can you tell our audience how the idea for the project came about?
Well, it started right at Civil War Museum. I went to a program there, and there were some African-American men and women at this program who were reenactors for Company F of the 29th United States Colored Troops. They're from Milwaukee, and most of the members of that company in the Civil War were credited to Milwaukee, and I'd never heard of them before. So I went back and asked my dad about that, if he knew anything about African-American soldiers from Wisconsin in the Civil War, and he said he didn't either. So somewhat out of embarrassment, I guess, I started doing some research on them. And, I met the reenactors, worked with them a little bit, started doing research on the real life members of their company, and did a presentation to them about a year and a half later that gave them a lot of specific information they didn't have before, including one particular soldier whose true life history was almost exactly the same as the character or the soldier portrayed by one of the members, one of the reenactors. So that was kind of pure chance. He made up the story, and the story was 95% true.
Wow.
So I kept working with them, but then kind of spread out and started looking at other Black soldiers from Wisconsin, and then also started running into information about African Americans who were employed by Wisconsin officers or Wisconsin regiments who weren't enlisted soldiers but who were with them through the war, and just kept expanding it and reached a point where I said, well, I'd done a number of presentations, including at Civil War Museum and other places, and kind of had reached the end, I thought. So I had this piles of information. I wrote a proposal to the Historical Society Press, asking if they were interested in publishing the book, and they wrote back immediately and said, yes, period, here's a contract. So they were very interested. So that was maybe 3 years ago, but I had done about 6 years of research prior to that on Company F of the 29th U.S. Colored Troops, and then basically any Black soldier or Civil War regiment employee from Wisconsin. So it's about 10 years of work.
Well, I know I've seen your presentation, and it has been, or one of them, it's been great. And you have such deep knowledge of these soldiers. So looking at the soldiers that signed up in Wisconsin in particular, did they all come from Wisconsin, or where did they originally come from when they were enlisting up here?
Very few were born in Wisconsin. There are probably less than 20. Most of them were born elsewhere. Most of them had been enslaved. Very few were born in the North and had never been slaves. The ones who were born in Wisconsin it's interesting, their lives are very parallel to early white settlers in that they were farmers, lumberjacks, lead miners. They lived in small towns and were farm laborers, very few in the cities because there really weren't big cities as such before the war, but many of them were born enslaved in the South. A few, those who actually enlisted in the state had been born in basically all over the country. The biggest chunk in Company F, the one that I'd started researching, many of them were from Missouri and their escape from enslavement had been to cross the Mississippi to a military base, an Army training base in Illinois, and they enlisted right there. So they'd gone from like one day to the next of being enslaved to being soldiers and therefore free. And so that was the majority of the men in Company F were Missouri men who had just escaped enslavement. But many of them told stories later about the ways their families suffered, those who had stayed behind in Missouri, because the war was Missouri was very divided. It's the only state that sent representatives to the Confederate and to the Union Congress. So it was very divided. It was a very brave act for them to take off and cross the river and volunteer. But that was a big chunk of that particular company. Later on, most of the men who served in the United States colored troops credited to Wisconsin actually enlisted in Wisconsin. And many of them were, again, very recent escapees from enslavement. So if you look at their enlistment locations, they were on the borders: Janesville, Prairie du Chien, La Crosse, up the river, Prescott, and Milwaukee, where they enlisted.
Jeff, you mentioned Company F, the 29th USCT. Did you find African-American soldiers from Wisconsin serving in other regiments as well?
Yeah, the 29th Regiment, and not just Company F, but that regiment had about 130 men who were credited to Wisconsin or who were from Wisconsin but not credited to Wisconsin. So there was a period where Illinois was recruiting, or Massachusetts was recruiting African-American soldiers, but Wisconsin wasn't. So there were men from here who wanted to serve, so they left the state. And so some from Racine went to Illinois and volunteered. And there were about a dozen who volunteered in Massachusetts regiments, including the 54th Massachusetts, probably the most famous African-American regiment in the Civil War. So the other units they served in were the 18th United States Colored Troops, 49th, 68th, 17th, and then there were scattered in other units too. It all depended on where they enlisted and where they got sent to. Most of the later, after Company F was filled, and the 29th was sent on to Virginia to fight, most of the Wisconsin men who volunteered were sent to St. Louis for training and to be incorporated into regiments there. So many of the Wisconsin men served in United States Colored Troops units that came out of Missouri. And the 49th United States Colored Troops was organized in Louisiana and served in Louisiana. So that was another one that had quite a few men from Wisconsin. One other one that doesn't get mentioned a great deal is the 3rd United States Colored Heavy Infantry, which was their official designation, but they never actually had any infantry. Artillery. They were organized as an artillery unit, but they really were equipped and worked as an infantry unit. They were stationed in Memphis, Tennessee through their whole service time. So that was kind of an unusual one. listed as artillery, but they're really infantry.
So after these men served and they were credited to Wisconsin, or they came from Wisconsin, did they return back to Wisconsin? Was there any fanfare or celebration or anything when they came back? What kind of reception did they receive? And if you have some, individual stories, we would love to hear them.
Almost all of these men went back to where they had lived before. So those who lived in Wisconsin prior to the war came back, mostly. Those who came from Missouri went back to Missouri. Many of the ones who were employed by Wisconsin officers or regiments who were from the deep South, Mississippi, Tennessee, et cetera, went back to the states that they came from. And all of that, if you think about that, why'd they go back there when they, had freed themselves by joining the Union Army or working with the Army? It's because it's where their families were, and because this was Reconstruction era. Slavery was abolished, and they actually had voting rights in the South for that period of the Reconstruction period. So things looked hopeful at that time. So it's understandable that they went back home. The Wisconsin men who came home had a mixed reception. There were a couple interesting stories with that. There was a veteran of the 54th Massachusetts named Arthur B. Lee, who ended up he was born in South Carolina, and then enlisted in Massachusetts, but he came to Wisconsin after the war. He was a harness maker and tried to set up shop in Janesville, and was basically boycotted out of town by the other harness makers who were all white. And he had connections with basically the abolitionist family in Milton, which ran the Milton House Hotel, which was a station on the Underground Railroad. So he somehow made connections with them. They brought him to Milton, basically set him up in business there, and that's where he lived and worked for the next 40 years. So that was a story of exclusion that turned out to be one where he was accepted in another town. There was another soldier, Henry Roseman, who lived briefly in Beaver Dam before the war. He had been enslaved, got north, and he got caught in a kind of a funny period of about 6 months where Wisconsin was drafting black men, but was not sending men to the U.S. colored troops. So these guys got drafted, but since Wisconsin wasn't sending to the U.S. colored troops, they put them into Wisconsin regiments, which prior to the war, black men were not accepted into the Wisconsin militia. And for the first couple of years of the war, they weren't either. But when the drafts came and they didn't have anywhere to place them, these men were accepted in Wisconsin regiments. So he was one who served in a Wisconsin infantry regiment. When he was discharged, within a couple of weeks, he was accosted on the streets of Beaver Dam by some white veterans who basically were walking toward him and expected him to get off the sidewalk and out of their way. Which sounds like a very deep South thing to happen, but that was Beaver Dam. And when he didn't get out of the way, they started beating on him. So a couple of them were arrested, taken before a judge. They were fined, went back out in the street, found him again, started beating him up even worse. So they were brought back into court. One of them who was from out of town was told to get out of town then and not come back. And the others were fine. But these, some of them were sons of prominent local officials, businessmen, et cetera. So that was, so it was a mixed reception. There were things like that happening. The early years after the war, there was more acceptance. Later on, as Reconstruction ended and things got worse in the South, things got worse in the North too. The restriction on where you could go if you were black. Theaters started creating separate sections, or there were locations in Milwaukee where African Americans were not allowed, where they had been before but were no longer allowed. So there were setbacks in terms of political and civil rights in the North as well, and those happened in Wisconsin. So one of the old gathering places in Milwaukee was the Schlitz Palm Garden. And there was a group in Milwaukee that had pushed through a civil rights bill in the state legislature in the 1890s. One of the leaders of that was John J. Miles, who was a Civil War veteran who had been very successful financially in Milwaukee up to that point. And so after the law passed, he went back to Schlitz Palm Garden and they wouldn't let him in. So they were charged, taken to court, and what happened in the legislature was the punishment for violating civil rights law was made so minimal that it was ineffective. In this case, they were fined $5 for not letting him in, and then went right back to doing the same thing again. So he won the case, but lost the war. And within about 10 years after that, he was the head waiter at the Plankinton Hotel, had done a lot to help other veterans get employed in Milwaukee and different things. And there was a change in ownership of the Plankinton Hotel. They let all the black waiters go, including him. So he went from being fairly wealthy, prosperous person to not even having a job anymore. So this was during that same time period when kind of things, shrank in general for African Americans, including the veterans.
Jeff, can you fill us in on your research for the book? Where did you find most of this information in these stories that you have, and where is the information located?
Well, some of it was at the Civil War Museum, particularly reference books, letters letters from soldiers. One of the hard things with researching this group is that the individual soldiers left very little written information, almost no letters. Many of them never learned to read or write. So there's not a lot that way, but there are a number of books, some from the Civil War Museum. So that's where I started. Then Historical Society Library in Madison is a wonderful place. They have so much information there, old newspapers in particular that I made a lot of use of, official records, marriage records, birth records, etc., death records. The biggest source, I think, on the individual soldiers, though, was the National Archives. I did many trips there to Washington, D.C., to their records. The pension files, documents of pension applications from Civil War veterans are all kept there. They're mostly not digitized, so you have to actually go there and handle the documents. And that was fun, if you like doing research. Many hours of looking through things. Some of them were a lot of links between the soldiers show up there. One of the things that I'd read in books about Black soldiers is that they didn't stay in touch with each other after the war. And some of that is based on the idea, well, they didn't write memoirs or didn't write regimental histories or whatever. Not only the fact that they didn't necessarily have writers in the group, didn't have readers in the group either. So they didn't want those, but they did have reunions. They did stay in touch with each other. And they did get together. And in the book, I have a table that's almost a full page of marriages between Civil War veteran soldiers and the sisters of their comrades. So is that more important than writing a book? Yeah, there are a lot of contacts, including in some cases contacts between soldiers who had moved out of state and those who were still in Wisconsin, who were writing documents and letters to support each other's pension applications. So the pension files are rich. They give the family histories. They tell you who the soldiers were in contact with, who their friends were from the war. It's great stuff. You could also see things like a soldier who signed his enlistment paper with an X in 1864, and in the 1880s is writing letters back and forth to an officer of the unit he served with, and very articulate letters. One of the soldiers that most interests me, I can imagine. I've imagined, I'm sitting around a table in a bar with a pot of coffee or a bottle of whiskey and just talking to these guys. There was one who lied about his age to get into the service, Aaron Roberts. He was from the Cheyenne Valley settlement in Vernon County. He was underage, but lied about his age to get in, and served in the Company F-29th U.S. Colored Troops. And he became a fairly wealthy man as a business owner. He'd had some health issues, had to give up farming, but he owned a factory in Hillsboro making barrel components, and was one of the biggest factories making these in the western states. Lost the business in the panic of 1893, just went bankrupt. Came out with some money, moved to Oshkosh, started a new business, basically doing what we now call flipping homes, where he'd take over a beat up house, fix it up, and sell it, and became fairly prosperous again. You know, so he's an interesting one who really made something out of himself. He was contacted frequently by the Pension Bureau because he was able to read and write, and seemed to have contact with a lot of people. So there are letters from him that pop up in all kinds of pension files where the Pension Bureau contacted him. Do you know anything about Caleb Hudson? Do you know anything about how Charles Allen died? You know, so because he was literate and sociable, he was often used by the by the Pension Bureau. He's interesting too, in that even in this period where African Americans are being restricted and rejected, there are a number of them, including Aaron Roberts, who were elected officers of their GAR posts. The GAR was the Grand Army of the Republic, the big veterans organization. He was an elected officer on the post in Hillsboro, and later on when he moved to Oshkosh, he was an officer there too. No, not in Oshkosh. He later moved to Baraboo. He was an officer there too. There was another soldier who was an officer of the GR post in Peshtigo, Racine. So there are a number of them who, even though things were getting more restricted for African Americans, these individuals were respected in the communities they were in for their military service.
So we're almost coming to the end of our time, which is unfortunate because I'm learning a lot from this conversation. So do you have any recommendations besides your upcoming book that we really are looking forward to reading, but any recommendations on books or websites or resources that those people interested in USCT soldiers could continue their research journey with?
One of the books that I started with was by Edward Miller. It was Black Civil War Soldiers from Illinois. And that was kind of a starting point when I was looking at Company F, because that was a regiment that was recruited and trained in Illinois, but had that Milwaukee company attached to it. The other books I found very useful with this was a book called Race and Reunion by David Blight, which goes into a lot of what happened 20 and 30 years after the war, when white veterans from the North and South started having reunions together to the exclusion of Black veterans. And that book really details what happened simultaneously in the North with the imposition of Jim Crow law in the South. I found that really interesting. So those are a couple. There have been a couple books written on the Battle of the Crater that Richard Slotkin, in particular, called The Crater. And that's fiction, but it's basically a very good description of what happened. There are quite a few other. One of the other ones I've really found interesting was As If It Were Glory by a white officer in the United States Colored Troops Regiment. He was from Wisconsin, from Sun Prairie, and private, but he became an officer in the 23rd United States Colored Troops, and he wrote the book in the same period where the participation of Black troops in the Civil War is being erased, basically, even though at the end of the war they were 10% of the Army. and he wrote an article for a series that was being published of, you know, stories of the Civil War, and they weren't interested in it because of what he said. So he wrote these for another magazine. They were serialized and it was published. That was a very interesting book because, among other things, he says they were the best unit I ever worked with. The black soldiers of the 23rd were the bravest soldiers I ever fought with. And he was with the Iron Brigade for a while, and they were, you know, a very famous fighting unit. So that's high praise. So that's an interesting one, and I believe it's at the Civil War Museum. So those are a few. There were a lot, but those are a few.
Perfect.
Well, Jeff, we thank you for your time this morning, and both Jen and I and everyone here at the museum look forward to the release of your book from the Historical Society. I know we're going to be seeing you again, hopefully in the virtual world, or maybe even in the real world, so to speak, when the book comes out in November, December, working with the press and doing some more programming surrounding the release of the book. So best of luck with it, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.
Okay.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks everybody for watching.
Take care.